In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, may the peace and blessings of God be upon our Prophet Muhammad and upon you all. And I hope to have a successful panel. I would like to welcome you all, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamu alaikum. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. In this session that followed, of course, the session follows lunch, so it might be heavy for some, but we are going to try to make it light in order to establish this balance between the different lunches, to lunch for the stomach and lunch for the brain. And this is a very important meeting here, and I have panelists here, and they have been working for more than a year. In 15 minutes, they're going to deliver the work of maybe 15 years of experience. So, thank you so much for being here with us. First and foremost, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for this invitation to attend this esteemed forum focusing on our beloved region, the Arabian Gulf. As it is well known, we have very new developments when it comes to the global economy. First of all, we had the COVID-19 pandemic, and then after the recovery, the world was taken by surprise. This Ukrainian-Russian war that had very difficult repercussions on global economies in general and Gulf economies in particular. Of course, the economic aspect is the uh, basis upon which politicians carry out their policies. Today, actually, the biggest evidence is the protests we are seeing in European countries. These protests reflect the economic repercussions on the livelihoods of the individuals and the societies. It is important, therefore, to think and analyze and reach conclusions and try to ask the question, what comes next? What comes after Ukraine? What are the challenges that the world is going to face and the Gulf is going to face in particular? And what kind of external and internal challenges that are going to be felt? And the repercussions actually are going to reverberate in several regions. These lessons that we need to learn from, we need to think about these lessons. And maybe this forum comes in on a very timely way because this is indeed discussing the crisis, and we hope that the researchers are going to be capable of elaborating a new vision when it comes to the inter-Gulf relations and the relations between the countries all over the world to face these challenges. I will not be lengthy, ladies and gentlemen. I have three musketeers here with me. The fourth is not here or is online maybe, and we are going to be discussing the impact of Ukraine crisis on the economies of the Gulf. So this is the title of the session. We have four papers. The first one is going to be the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian war on global and Gulf energy markets. This paper is going to be presented by two researchers. The first one is Dr. Thomas O'Donnell, and the second is Mr. Laurence al-Hinawi. And the second paper is entitled The Impact of the Ukrainian Crisis on Inflation in GCC States. The speaker is going to be Mr. Ayhab Saad. He is here on my right hand side. The third paper is entitled Gulf States and the Ukraine War Between Climate Commitments and Energy Security Anxieties. And this is going to be delivered by Mr. Rachid al-Bazzim. We will start with the first paper in order not to be lengthy in the introduction. So, the impact of the Russian Ukrainian war on global and Gulf energy markets. And Dr. Thomas O'Donnell, you will start presenting. So before you start, I will introduce you. Dr. O'Donnell is an academic analyst and consultant on the global energy system. He has taught courses on energy and resources and international relations and development at several international universities, to include the University of Michigan, Ohio State University, New School University, and the Studley Institute of International Affairs. He has worked as a researcher at several research centers, including the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies and Fulbright Scholar and a visiting professor at the Center for Study of Development at the Center University of Venezuela. The second speaker is Mr. Laurence al-Hinawi. He is a researcher on Gulf studies and previously a researcher at the Technical University of Darmstadt in Germany. He has authored numerous publications, including the Arabic translation and of Rolf Steininger. Actually, you can see the booklet to see the publications of Mr. Lawrence. So, uh, we are going to listen to them in order to talk about the short or medium term and long term and focus on the sanctions imposed by the United States and its allies on Russia, which could impact the status of Russia and maybe transforming Russia to a secondary player. So, this is not me, this is actually the researcher who said so. And also, the paper is going to highlight how the GCC could put themselves at the center of today's chaotic market to enhance their short and long term centrality in the European, Indian, and possibly Chinese markets lost by Russia, which would strengthen their economies. Please join me in welcoming the two speakers. Thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening. I would like to thank the Arab Center for this invitation and specifically Dr. Marwan Kabalan. It is my great pleasure to present to you the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian war on global and Gulf energy market, and from a European and German perspective to a certain extent. So, when we talk about the legislations of free market, Europe and Germany actually were the hostage to the supplies from Russia. There's also room for disagreement with the US partner because of Nord Stream 2. The European reliance on Russian energy threatened the security in Europe. We need to understand the implicit Russian strategy by focusing on gas, not oil, and the relation with Europe. More than half of the exports go to Europe, and we're talking about approximately $91 billion in 2021. It is important to understand that Russia has more revenue from oil rather than natural gas to Europe. All of natural gas comes through pipelines to Europe, which means that finding alternatives need either building new pipelines for the close suppliers or counting on LNG. And although the capacity of getting more quantities using the current networks of pipelines or the new pipelines to be built in the coming years is possible in theory, especially after the intensive negotiations between the United States, Algeria, Egypt, Azerbaijan, Norway, Israel. But the relative increase is not going to be but through LNG. The US is the most important importer of gas to Europe. 75% of the LNG coming from the US was diverted to Europe because of the war of Russia. Despite that, the LNG refineries in Europe, facilities actually, are very are under pressure, and there is a need to have new facilities in addition to the cost to have reservoirs on the coastline and building pipelines to link them to the local networks to pump gas. This will need some time. In the German case, for instance, especially that the contracts by Berlin for the floating or other facilities will require 2 years or more. Spain and Portugal have a bigger capacity to import LNG, and Spain is linked to the Algerian uh, network. But there are no pipelines from these two countries to Europe because President Macron did not want to execute the planned pipeline for national commercial interests of France and the impact on the environment. And just like my colleagues said, we are talking about complex details that form the event. And Dr. Majid said so, and Dr. Mustafa Bazarkan as well. 2 days ago, President Macron agreed with Spain and Portugal to have this under the water line. So I think it was on Thursday. And despite the fact that the US and Qatar in particular have large reserves, the development needs some time. The United States that started exporting LNG accepted to increase productivity or production. Qatar will need 2 to 3 years to increase production to 110 cubic meters. The strategy of Russia actually uses the card of gas because it hurts Europe the most. It hurts European economies the most. And this could lead to a recession in the coming months. The objective of this strategy is the increasing prices, and the shortage will result in angry population, and the societies of Europe are actually witnessing these divides between populist, extremist, right-wing movement, and also there's the more advanced and developed and the least wealthy countries. In Germany, for instance, the Saxonia First Minister asked the German government to sign long-term contracts with countries like Qatar and also importing Russian gas after the war. So we are seeing a sequencing of events and we are witnessing a shift in the positions. Putin, who understands today that it is impossible for him to achieve a victory at the military level, he knows or he tries to break the alliance between European countries. He has high hopes when it comes to this energy war. When it comes to the GCC, the return to centrality based on the study of Mr. Alterman, as described by Dr. Shaiji. This requires moving at this particular timing in order for these countries to become the main exporter to Europe in addition to the US. Gas is a geostrategic weapon more than ever, and this would give a status for the countries that are exporting gas for the coming decades, especially that the consequences will impose on economies in Europe, especially the revisiting the strategies against fossil fuels, and we have witnessed this in Germany this year. Despite the shutting down of the three stations, the Chancellor actually extended until the end of April. And I give the floor to Dr. O'Donnell. طابت أوقاتكم. أود أن أتشكر
My
المركز
first
العربي
visit, and it's very enjoyable, very interesting. I'm learning a lot. So, um, our topic, Lorenz al-Hinawi and myself, our topic today is the European energy crisis as a second front of the actual hot war that's taking place in Ukraine. So we all know the history of this, the 2014 initial invasion and the 2022. I'm just going to give some background. This issue came up yesterday a lot, so I thought a little bit I'd mention, you know, what is this war about in the grander scheme of things? And I think ever since around 2007, it was quite clear with the speech Putin gave at Munich that Russia had rejected joining the liberal democratic European order. Russia had been invited by Europe and by the United States to join this order, and it was clear at that point they weren't interested. Russia wanted to escape being, how they would see it, a rump state with all the former Soviet republics taken away. Without this, without especially what was considered as a buffer states in USSR time, Ukraine, Belarus, and Georgia especially, there's no way that Russia could be a superpower. And I think this has a lot to do with what motivates Mr. Putin. Now, what means, I'm happy that we could talk about that much more. I'm just very quick, okay? But the question is, in order to achieve these aims, what are the means that the present-day Russia has? Of course, we know there's military aggression. There was 2008 in Georgia, 2014 in Ukraine, and again in Ukraine. And we know that's not going very well for Mr. Putin. But the other thing is the weaponization of energy. And this is, I hope to show you how this has been a long-term weapon in progress that's been thought about actually since before Mr. Putin came to power, but at least 20 years, 22 or 24 years in present Russia. The weaponization of energy. Russia still, when this war began, was still an energy superpower. I don't think anyone considered it a military superpower aside from the nuclear weapons. And it can use this to try and split off. The whole idea of the energy war is to split the Europeans amongst themselves and against the countries against each other and their societies, and to undermine the support for Ukraine, okay? So I'm going to talk about gas, and I'm not going to talk about oil. I would love to talk about oil. I worked on oil for a long time. Just if you want to ask me about it, I have opinions about that whole other side of things, but I'm going to focus on gas. So Russia, since at least 2000, was deeply involved, mostly with German leaders, in building these detour pipelines, I call it, Nord Stream 1 and 2, and there was also this Turk Stream around the south of Europe. I'll show you why I call them detour pipelines in a moment. It reroutes the exports to the European Union that used to go through mainly through Ukraine or through Belarus and Poland. It reroutes them around the north and the south. It's a huge infrastructure project. It's one of the biggest infrastructure projects in European history if you look at it together. Okay. So here's a map of the European pipeline system. And so initially, the gas that flowed in Soviet times came through these pipelines here, as I said, across Ukraine and Belarus, and Poland as well, to some extent. And these countries here. Now, because Russia has certain designs on those countries, in order to preserve the business of Gazprom, should in the future there be those countries be disrupted or invaded or whatever, it was necessary to build new pipelines, and this started around 2000, a pipeline system around the north, the Nord Stream, and then there was some controversy about what route it would take, but it ended up being Turk Stream around the south. And so by these water routes, it completely avoids any states that used to be dominated by the Soviet Union, okay? So that transit is cut out, and that's the new transit. Here's the ones across the top. Nord Stream, you see, is completely in the water, arrives here in Germany, directly from Russia, no involvement with these other former Soviet-dominated countries. Initially, the plan for this pipeline around the south was to come into Bulgaria, but the EU stopped that in 2015 on the basis of the third energy package, the legal basis that it wasn't transparent. And so this is the change. Can you see that? Uh, the route was changed. There was an agreement made with Mr. Erdogan, and the pipeline went through Turkey instead. And now, all through this period, the Russian side and the Germans, who were their partners, would say, this is not geostrategic, this is just business, and various explanations, okay? And so it would say it's not geostrategic. So a diplomat friend of mine, we were at this conference in Berlin, 2019, and the Deputy Minister of Energy of Russia is speaking, explaining why they're building the pipelines. And he says, we're building these pipelines here to avoid zones of conflict. And these are the countries he considers zones of conflict, which is exactly what I just told you, okay? So this is how the Russians also looked at it, frankly. So the Russian strategy was this rerouting. And, well, I'm not going to talk about this in detail. I'm happy to answer questions. But there is this question that always comes up, especially in Europe, as to why is it that the Germans supported this program? And they decided to put their individual energy security above the security of Ukraine, I would say, and this was a failed policy. So, and this was opposed by other states in the EU. It was a very lively debate in the EU on this question. So, with the military front failing inside Ukraine, this becomes very important that Moscow has to split the supporters and on the basis of energy. They have, as my colleague was pointing out in Arabic, they have certain advantages in this, in that Europe is so over-dependent on Russian gas. And Europe has failed, especially Germany, but Europe, to build alternative infrastructure. And there's some poor planning with renewables that took place. No storage. It turns out that if you have no storage and you have 30, 40% renewables, what do you do when the wind doesn't blow? You turn on gas turbines. So gas actually was becoming more geostrategically important because of the move towards renewables. This wasn't well thought out, okay? This, of course, was something I would say the Russian side understood very well, the vulnerabilities, okay? So in the long term, as my colleague had pointed out, in the long term, the transatlantic alliance can replace all the Russian oil and gas. There's no question there's enough reserves in the world of oil and gas. There's the finance, there's the technology, there's functioning markets, whether it's gas in Qatar, gas in the United States from fracking, oil in many places. But the infrastructure, and it takes time. So it's going to be a matter of years. And in that short run, that's when Russia has a great lever over Europe. So I'm just going to show you the extent of the dependence. So I go back to just pre-corona, which was sort of a typical year, how things were, okay, and how they would have returned eventually. So this top part up here is the EU production that EU produced itself, about 42%. This is the pipelines from Russia, about 41% of their imports at that time. And the rest is from other non-European pipelines, Algeria, LNG from Qatar, so forth, from the United States. So you can see the heavy dependence on Russia. I'm sorry, now, the EU production, if you look at that EU production, that's where it was going. It was going down. So that meant the plan was to increase the red stuff, okay, increase the stuff from Russia on the understanding, very strong point of view from the Germans in particular. I'm in Berlin, so I hear this all the time, is that LNG was just too expensive from Qatar or from the United States. The Poles, for example, and the United States would argue strenuously, but you get a security benefit from that investment, and you can buy spot at times. And the countries that did that actually got like Poland and Lithuania had offshore terminals. They were expensive, but the Russians actually voluntarily gave them a cut in the price because it was competition, and they paid for their terminals. So, anyway, but Europe didn't do that. Now, those countries were all going down. Norway was staying about the same. Gazprom, it was this is the Russian dependence, and there was, some potential in the future, and I have explained that. So that was the situation. Now that's been cut. There's some still flowing across Ukraine, some in Turk Stream, but it's essentially cut. Now what do you do? So the EU, I just want to, as I go through this, let you know, the EU has not put sanctions on Russian gas. They also made a carve-out. Together with the United States, you can pay for Russian gas according to your contract in euros or dollars. You can pay for it. So the idea that the Europeans have cut this As Mr. Putin repeatedly says, it's just not simply not how it's happened. The EU did say that they do not trust the Russians anymore, and they're going to move away, and they have a plan for moving away, but they didn't break the contracts by refusing to take delivery. So Putin knows his time is limited, and if he's going to weaponize something, this is the time to do it, before that replacement comes. So this is, it's sort of like we have soap operas in the United States, you know, these complicated stories that change every day with different heroes and heroines. It's sort of like that, this story. But before the war, Russia was already weaponizing the gas supply. And just to say very quickly, in 2019, there was a glut of gas because of pandemic. In 2020, 2021, it was very cold in Europe, and the wind didn't blow, and there's an overdependence on wind. So that gas was all used up, almost totally used up, to make electricity. Putin, knowing what he wants to do in Ukraine, says, aha, their storage is empty. This is a lever. And so it turned out he didn't send, from March of that year, he didn't send gas. Now, my research at the time showed that he was making like the gas godfather. If you connect Nord Stream 2, I'll give you gas. You could get it if you connect it. And making this threat, but looking into it, talking to people who were working in Russia at the time, said, our storage is empty too. He has to fill our storage. So he actually didn't have extra gas. He only had extra gas around September, and then he didn't send it to Europe. Instead of that, he shut down the flows. And so he worked as much as he could to keep the storage as low as possible before last winter. But last winter, all I can say is we were lucky. It wasn't so, you know, the wind blew and it wasn't so cold, and we got through without a crisis. So he's playing the same game again this winter, but this winter, what happened in that previous winter is he cut off the spot gas. The spot gas mainly came through the Yamal-Europa pipeline across Belarus and Poland. He cut that. But the contracted flows more or less continued. So the next stage of this was he started just before this winter, he started to cut gas flows. But they have a problem. If you're going to cut the gas flows, there's long-term contracts. He's got to claim force majeure, or he's going to owe a lot of money. He'll be taken to arbitration court, okay? And he'll be liable. And all Gazprom property can have liens put on it. It's a huge, billions of property, pipelines, storage facilities, refineries, even ships could be seized in the long run. So he had to be careful. In retrospect, I'm not saying this was completely obvious at the time. So at first, he demanded rubles. It wasn't very legal and so forth. He said, if you don't pay in rubles, you've broken the contract, but this didn't really hold up too well. He cut some countries off who wouldn't pay rubles, but there was even any paid in rubles, and he still cut them off. So, you know, obviously that's not something you use for force majeure. Then there was this whole drama about the compressors on Nord Stream 1, a line that's been running since 2011, never broke, and suddenly all the compressors are broken, right? And said, oh, I can't take the compressor back that was repaired outside the country because of sanctions. The German chancellor stood in front of it, said, here it is, please come and take it, and they wouldn't come and take it. So, and Siemens said, this is baloney, it's not true. We can fix those compressors online. It's not, so there goes the force majeure. So he totally cut the gas flow because he's preparing for a gas, you know, for an energy war this winter. He's desperate, but he needs an excuse. Well, it's quite interesting what happened next. Somebody blew up the pipelines, right? And so this is an unambiguous force majeure. He can't send the gas. The pipelines are broken, which leads me to think who blew up the pipeline, right? And who would have the tech? It's obviously a state. It's obviously not some divers. It can't be done in that way. So it's obviously a state. It's, you know, to me, it's quite clear it's the Russian side who did this. And what's really telling, each pipeline, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream 2 never came online because he was weaponizing gas, and there was an agreement with the Americans made by Merkel that pipeline wouldn't come online if he weaponized. So that's not certified. Nord Stream 1, he blew up both the strings are blown up, but only one string of Nord Stream 2. Who would blow up the pipelines and leave one string? Everybody knows that pipeline, the Poles and the Eastern Europeans, the Baltic states, Ukraine, the United States, absolutely they didn't want that pipeline connected. They felt this was a betrayal of the Europeans' interest that the Germans were involved in. Now the Germans are under tremendous pressure to approve the certification of that pipeline because Putin is saying, I was allowed, there's no sanctions, I was allowed to send gas through Nord Stream 1, so let me send it through Nord Stream 2. So it makes the maximum during the winter when the gas is low, this will make the maximum dispute as companies go bankrupt, turn it back on. And again, are the Germans working with the Russians? It'll create the maximum tension. So it's an interesting, I would say, tactics. Okay. There's been a lot of, I can't really get into this too much, but the whole struggle now of the European Union to desperately get gas. And we know who are the players who can provide it, USA, Qatar, Norway, Algeria, so forth. There's been very active American diplomacy on this. You know, the Americans had discovered through intelligence well before the war began that it was going to begin. My understanding is not only did they warn the Ukrainian government and the Europeans, they actually warned the Chinese as well. And it's not clear if the Chinese actually believed them, but it's very interesting that the Americans were warned what the Russians are doing. I would have been interesting to be at that discussion. Okay? So they've been trying to do diplomacy to help further this. There's a lot of diplomacy, as you know, between Europe and Qatar. Also, the Germans are interested. And let's see. These are the difficulties. I think what I'd like to focus on in my few minutes is, coming from Germany, it's a microcosm of some problems. It's more concentrated than the rest of Europe. I'd say there's ideological and political problems. There's unrealistic ideas about how fast the transition to so-called green energy should go, that it's even possible to have 100% renewables without nuclear energy, and to cut out fossil fuels so quickly I think is unrealistic when there's no storage and so forth. So we have a problem in Germany. Exactly as the energy war begins, who becomes the captain or the general of the energy war is our energy minister and economics minister. It's the first time the Greens got the position. So it makes perfect sense to leave perfectly safe nuclear power plants online, but he'd get thrown out of his party if he does this, right? So he had to allow the chancellor to force him to leave them online, okay? So I think there's a similar problem in the negotiations coming to Qatar and other countries for LNG. 2 minutes, okay. Is that it's difficult for a minister in that position to agree to contracts, say, over 10 years, because the promises in 10 years are supposed to be carbon neutral, right? So why don't you promise that in 10 years, this gas that we're buying will turn into hydrogen? Well, that's not, I don't think that's very realistic. So somehow obviously the Qataris, but also the Norwegians warned them, and also Americans who need longer term contracts because of the investments involved, okay? Now on the Qatari side, there's also these ideas of destination clauses, which are clearly against the law in the European Union as a whole, and the Germans can't do anything about that. And that was actually a law put in there against the Russians putting destination clauses. So when somebody comes and talks about destination clauses, it should be understood this raises issues of what we were fighting with the Russians about, right, for a more liberal market. So these are things, hopefully, that can get sorted out. So I just want to say what could be done by the GCC on this. Obviously, you have a long-term possibility of new gas relationship with Europe and oil relationship with Europe, and hopefully a more realistic view of how natural gas in particular is part of the transition for a long time. The other thing I would point out, I don't know, a year ago today, I was at, the ambassadors here from Ukraine, I was at the first annual Ukraine Gas Investment Congress. Now, given the strategic situation, there weren't a lot of investors there. But I realized they have resources, reasonable resources, not high rents you're not going to get, but it can produce, and this is a matter of national security for the country. You know, people will make money. So it's just a suggestion. Since other investors don't want to take these risks, and also since there are bars on various public banks making investments, if Qatar or the other GCC countries were the first to move to make an investment, say in the west of the country, and to invite to match other countries that came in, this would be seen very positively in Europe, and I imagine in Ukraine as well, and help them maybe get their industry moving. It's a suggestion. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Laurence, Mr. Thomas. Thank you, Mr. Laurence. Now we'll continue our today very interesting, enjoyable meeting. Our second speaker, Mr. Ayhab Saad. أهلا وسهلا مستر أيهب. السيد أيهب الحقيقة عنده ورقة بعنوان تأثير أزمة أوكرانيا في التضخم.
Titled Impact of the Ukrainian Crisis in Inflationary Matters, and he is an assistant professor at Doha Institute. He got his PhD from Michigan University in 2014, and previously he was assistant professor at Bir Zayt University. His research interests focus on liberating local markets and the impact of that on renovation and innovation, and also the economic integration between the Middle East and North African regions. And today he will be talking about the impact of the Ukrainian crisis on inflation in GCC states, and also use the data available to examine the situation with the inflation in GCC states and to understand the impact of that first, and also to isolate it from other impacts like the corona pandemic. And Mr. Ayhab also will try to understand the situation in GCC in comparison with other countries, and finally he will conclude by what the Gulf countries are doing to mitigate the impact of the crisis. We have 20 minutes. Thank you very much for inviting me. When the organizers invited me to speak about the war in the Ukraine and its impact on inflation, the first reaction was, oh Lord, everybody wants to know about inflation because it is the talk of the hour. Everybody wants to know about it. And it's not necessarily easy to tackle, to try and understand the reasons and causes of inflation is difficult enough without being in a war situation, let alone if you're dealing with it in the context of a war situation. I'll do my best to discuss with you. Does the war in the Ukraine have an impact on the GCC countries from the point of view of inflation? If you want a quick answer because you want to leave the room, I'll say look at the map and then you can go. You see, this is a map of inflation. The darker the color, the higher the inflation rate is. In the black areas, it's over 25%. In the lighter colors, it means it's a less serious situation. With the green zones indicate 1 to 5% inflation. I got this map from the IMF. It's clear that the Gulf area is green, which means that the inflation rates are not that high in comparison, except for the UAE, which is purple or red. This is because it's 5.5%, and even though it's still less than Europe or the United States, where in some cases between 8% and over. So a quick reply to your question will be no impact, no inflationary impact on the war on the GCC countries. But let's delve into some more details. In Qatar, we all live in Qatar. I decided to look at Qatar because we live here. And from September 21 to September 22, if we look at the yellow line is the annual using the consumer price index. The dotted line, discontinuous line, is the monthly rate. It's clear that even before the war started here, February 2022. So there was an upward trend. It was difficult then to say what impact the war had because there were already inflationary pressures because of the pandemic. So it seems that there is a high annual rate of around 6%, but it doesn't seem that the direction has changed. If this is the monthly rate, it doesn't look as if it was impacted more. January, February, it went down, then it went up again. So there has been some impact, but it was probably less than what we had expected. Of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that there was no impact at all. The yellow line, the figures I just gave to you, is the inflation measured in consumer price index. This is except housing, electricity, water, and other household expenditures. If we exclude that, then we will see that the annual rate there is about 5%. If we excluded the electricity, water, and some types of fuel and household expenditure. I wanted to focus on accommodation because maybe part of the inflation or the 6% inflation rate in Qatar is due to high accommodation costs or some foodstuffs because we know if there is an impact of this war on the GCC countries, it is likely to come from two sides. Oil prices, because of the rise in the oil prices, because Russia was a primary supplier and supply was disrupted. And the second thing which will have a direct impact is the price of food and foodstuffs because we know both Russia and the Ukraine are amongst the basic suppliers of foodstuffs. It's well, if we look at the figures here from the period after the start of the war, there has been some change, a rise in the food prices. Also in accommodation, there has been also water and electricity in 2022. There's been a rise, and this is also difficult to say whether it's due to the war or is it due to other reasons. We know Qatar is hosting the FIFA World Cup in 30 days, and maybe this had something to do with the rise in the cost of accommodation and not necessarily linked to the war in the Ukraine, specifically when it comes to the cost of accommodation, water and electricity and utilities. If we leave aside the figures, because the figures do indicate that there is an impact, although it's not very high, and also from a theoretical point of view, we can say that the war can have an impact on inflationary rates in the world, first of all. Let's look at that, then first focus also a little bit on the Gulf. So far as the world is concerned, of course, through the production, and production is disrupted because of war, and this will impact the supply, and that will have some inflationary impact. Also, the disruption to the supply chains And of course, this was impacted, but although it was present before the war, it started with the COVID pandemic. Also, the impact on production and the supply chains, and the impact of that on the supply side of the economy. Maybe another cause can be the rise in the cost of transportation, also land routes and sea and routes and air freight routes have had to be changed, and also the geopolitical risks. There was a noticeable rise in the concerns of investors who, and this had an impact on investment, for example. This is from a global point of view and is not necessarily applicable to the GCC countries. The question we want to ask, the problem this paper is trying to address, is this, does the war in the Ukraine have an impact on the GCC, and if so, is it different than the way it's been impacting the world? So how can the war in the Ukraine impact one country more than another? I think we need to focus on certain aspects. First of all, the direct economic exposure. Uh, by that I mean the size of the trade exchange between the country concerned and Russia and the Ukraine. The more the country is exposed, it will be impacted more, whether to do with inflation or any other aspect. The second point is the geographical location, the closeness to the area of the conflict, and like questions of refugees, internally displaced people, also the spillover of the conflict itself, or or its political aftermath and consequences. The final point, which I think may have something to do or may increase the impact of the war on a certain country, is the political exposure. The more stronger or closer the political ties between the country concerned and the Ukraine or Russia, this will raise doubts and um, hinder the readiness of investors to invest in that country. So therefore, these points can increase or decrease the impact of war. How can we classify the Gulf countries? So this is the contribution I can make in this paper, is based on this. If we look at the Gulf countries, I chose three, and I apologize for not including the others. We have Qatar, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Here we see the percentage of Qatari imports from Qatar. Sorry, from Russia. Only 1% of Qatar's imports in 2021 comes from Russia. Less than 1%, about half a percent, is from the Ukraine. In Saudi Arabia, the figures are similar. Less than 1% from Saudi Arabia's imports come from Russia or the UAE. The same almost applies to the UAE. Their import from Russia is just above 1% of the total percentage of imports. From Russia, from UK is 0.2% of the total imports. So therefore, the direct economic exposure in these three countries, at least with Russia and the Ukraine, is minimal, almost very little. So therefore, in the first point we talked about as a likely cause of impact, then we can close that channel down because that's not applicable because the exposure is very little, insignificant. Maybe someone will argue by saying that you are looking at the total imports, but if you look at particular goods, in particular, like for example, the food imports, to my surprise, when I looked at that figure, I discovered that the imports of wheat, for example, from Russia and the Ukraine, does not occupy that an important position. The figures definitely are just higher, but they don't go beyond 10%. Maybe in Oman is the highest because their imports of wheat of make up some 10% of the total imports. For the UAE and Qatar, it's about between 5 to 7%, which is relatively low. Hopefully, I'll finish before. What one aspect I didn't think about before I started this project, and maybe it will be an important point which can really warrant more research interest, and my paper is still a working process. That is the geopolitical risk aspect. The geopolitical risk index, this is based on a new paper in the American Economic Review in 2020, and this graph I took it from the Federal Reserve Board staff, Fed. This is an index of the geopolitical risks since 1970. In the Gulf until 1990, the sparks, so 9/11 went up because there was political and geopolitical tension in the Russian war on the Ukraine. Also, the spike is very noticeable, which means that there is a high political tension. We notice that after that, the index starts to go down because at the beginning, people's expectations were very strong that this tension or this conflict may expand, and even just before the breakout of the war, what I'm trying to conclude here is there was a rise in the level of tension, and this is no strange, of course, by any means. This is a more interesting map. We try here to present the geopolitical concerns in 2020 and other, or 2022 rather, and the level of exposure of each country to the war in the Ukraine. Say at the level of companies, they follow how many times the war in the Ukraine was mentioned as a hindrance to the work of the company. The countries in red indicate that the impact of the Ukraine war is very high. The color in gray and the countries presented in gray means that less than 10% of the companies are impacted, which is an indication of the level of impact of the war on countries in the world. And also, look, we must see that in the Gulf region, the number of countries who mentioned the war is very low, except the UAE. I'll leave it here. And in answer to the question, is there an impact of the war in the Ukraine on inflationary trends? In my opinion, it's a very small and limited impact, if any. And the reason is the trade between the Gulf countries and Russia and Ukraine is very small, and the economic exposure is very small. And at the political exposure level, also, it's very low compared to other countries. So, therefore, moving forward, I'll try to develop uh, an index for the corporates, and because this will have more of an importance, maybe, and it seems that whatever inflationary rates which prevail now in the Gulf countries have probably a lot more to do with the global trends rather than the Ukraine war.
I have a suggestion actually to stop because I feel you are tired. Some of you, I can see that you are tired. Let us stop then. I will just give you intros about the speakers and open the floor for chat. If you agree, please raise your hand. Unfortunately, we cannot hear the gentleman without microphone. No, no, no. I was joking with you. So we will end with a beautiful paper that you are going to enjoy. It is about Gulf states and the Ukraine war between climate commitments and energy security concerns or anxiety. And this paper is going to highlight the position of KSA and UAE when it comes to oil production, and uh, we are going to talk about the different aspects. And also, the paper attributes this to trade interests, the Yemen war, and the issue of human rights, which are all factors that led to the two states to adopt a position of neutrality on the Ukraine crisis. The paper seeks to answer a series of questions about the implications of the Ukraine crisis for the energy sector and the role of the Gulf states. It also offers an analysis of the options available to Gulf states for dealing with the energy related crisis and speculates about the future of climate commitments given the dominance of power relations and concerns about energy security. The paper concludes that Arab Gulf states' revenues from energy exports are likely to reach unprecedented levels. At the same time, these states will work to gradually reduce emissions and develop new export opportunities, particularly in hydrogen derivatives and low carbon industrial goods. But who's the speaker? This is the most important thing. Who is Rachid al-Bazzim? Rachid al-Bazzim is a research professor at Ibn Zahar University in Agadir, Morocco. You reminded us of good old days, Agadir, a beautiful place in the beautiful country, Morocco. He was previously professor of public law at the Faculty of Legal, Economic and Social Sciences at Hassan I University. He has published numerous studies on energy in Arab Gulf states, most recently, Gulf states and challenges of shifts in the energy sector, published in Siyasat Arabiya in 2019, and exploring the future of energy shift in the Arab world, the case of Morocco, which appeared in Istishraf in 2018. I will not be lengthy. I would like to welcome Mr. Rashid. 20 minutes to you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, may the peace and blessings of God be upon our Prophet Muhammad and upon you all. I would like to thank the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for organizing this forum, really well organized forum, and valuable presentations that we have been attending and benefiting from. To add to what Mr. Chairman Habib Allah Turkistani, actually, it's a great pleasure to be here with you today and with all the panelists. I would like to say that now this is the sixth session, and we have a clearer picture. This crisis undoubtedly strengthened the role of the Gulf states on the global energy market, and also this crisis increased dependence on fossil fuels in order to be as an alternative for Russia's decision to cut supplies, particularly when it comes to uh, Europe. Fossil fuels, this attention that they are getting, actually diverted the attention from uh, climate engagement and climate commitment. The priority now, when it comes to the Ukraine crisis, is focusing on fossil fuels to guarantee supplies, fulfill the needs, and also increasing or decreasing production depending on the geopolitical development and the supply and demand rule. Gulf countries play a key role on international energy markets. First of all, when it comes to natural gas in the state of Qatar, Qatar wants to increase its production by 60% in 2024. So this reveals the fact that Qatar will become the number one natural gas exporter. This is not a coincidence because the natural gas is going to go hand in hand with this transition in the energy field. Uh, the global societies and global institutions agreed through a series of agreements to move forward when it comes to climate commitments. When it comes to oil, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait are among the top 10 oil producers in the world. However, the main point is the supply surplus in the capacity in of production. We are talking about 2 million barrels a day to control. This is for Saudi Arabia to control the oil markets. Sometimes this happens by using this very important card, which is the surplus in production capacity. So we're talking about uh, focus negotiations, geopolitical negotiations are shifting towards the region, particularly in the context of the crisis in Ukraine. We can actually summarize the scene by talking about five main factors. So the climate commitments. Dr. Kapshin from the United States talked about this yesterday. He said the future is going to be renewables, and today the panelists in the session that talked about the relations between Japan and the Arab Gulf states. So the colleagues from Japan highlighted Japan's approach to continue developing hydrogen and in collaboration with gas exporting countries. But the question remains, is it possible for leading countries and technologies? Is it possible for them to do this transfer of technology, and particularly when it comes to Gulf countries? So, training experts in order to build self capacities in the region. So this paper is always going to focus on the future. Uh, at the same time, it highlights the needs that we are currently facing. So there is an increasing attention given to gas because gas, as I have said, is going to be perceived as eco-friendly, green, or less polluting than oil, and this is why there is big importance given to the transfer of gas. Is it through pipelines with all the complex geopolitical issues all over the world? Several papers talked about geopolitical problems because of the pipelines, gas pipelines. Is it going to be in the form of liquefied, so the LNG through ships and big carriers? And it seems that this method was employed largely during the Ukraine crisis to supply Europe. Of course, Europe had to find alternatives. India and China are present when it comes to the consumption of fossil fuels. We notice that China's consumption is in line with the policies implemented by the Chinese authorities in terms of the climate when it comes to controlling emissions or planting trees on a large scale in the country. So China is trying to play both sides, both cards. So production by continuing to rely on imported fossil fuels, and of course the Asian market is a very important market for Gulf countries, and also during the intervention of our colleague from Russia in the previous session. So he said that, and he is right in my opinion, the Asian market could become a scene for competition between the foreign imports of fossil fuels and also the Russian imports, especially headed towards China, India, South Korea, and Japan. The energy sector actually witnesses a leading role by the United States, which is quasi self-sufficient. It is very important that the United States put an end to the vulnerability in the field of energy when it comes to its policies. The United States is highly independent now, which offered the US several options internationally, especially revisiting its role in the Gulf and the minimal involvement in Libya, how they managed the Syrian dossier as well, and the negotiations regarding the nuclear deal with Iran. So the United States managed to put an end to the vulnerability that it suffered from in the field of energy sector, and provided the United States with the capacity to have new targets and to maneuver using new tools. This is a winning card in the hand of the United States. The US is actually giving lessons to some Europeans now, like when it comes to what we are seeing at the level of the White House coming during the meeting between Biden and Chancellor Scholz. He talked about the necessity of not having Nord Stream 2 functional, and this is what our two colleagues mentioned in their presentation. So the energy sector is key, particularly in the Gulf region. This comes in the context of the economic diversification policies. For instance, Kuwait is the least diversified. According to Moody's, I think we're talking about 45% of Kuwait's GDP is based on fossil fuels, and also we have other countries with different percentages. So, in general, this crisis revealed that the region is important and highlighted the key role of GCC states internationally, particularly when it comes to the global energy markets. The first results were good or positive economic results. The Saudi economy this year, of course, our colleagues are honoring us with their presence here. So the growth in Saudi Arabia is expected to be 10% in 2022, according to the IMF projections. And the IMF gave another figure regarding the revenue of Gulf states from this boom in the oil sector. By 2026, we're talking about 1.3 trillion dollars, which is a very important figure, and decision makers and policy makers in the region need to use a share of this to focus on this industry. So, especially in light of the commitments in terms of climate, this is the future. This needs to be taken into account when it comes to the policies and given the statements of government officials on different occasions. Also, in terms of the climate commitments, the region is going to organize the 28th, so the COP 28, and we're talking about 2023 in the UAE. So this is an important event. It reflects the fact that Gulf countries are moving towards integrating climate commitments into economic policies. This is also a message to the different nations all over the world, saying that climate is not only present in official statements, it is actually reality in the regions. So we can ask some questions. 5 minutes. The most important repercussions and the options. I will try to be very brief. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. So the most important repercussions, actually the positive impact after the Ukrainian crisis, and President Biden met the Emir of Qatar and considered Qatar an important non-NATO ally. This is important, very important when it comes to security and security prospects for the state of Qatar, and the Qataris were more realistic and they have reiterated that the uh, 2026, so the agenda is full until 2026 when it comes to the demand on gas, and they focus on the necessity to find diplomatic solutions to the Ukrainian crisis. This also opens an opportunity for other partners in the region. So the reshaping of the U.S. role in the region, will China replace the United States of America as a controlling power or a security guarantor? Is it based on regional blocks? Is it based on individual capabilities and capacities in the countries of the region? All of these questions are asked. The most important thing is diversifying partners and defending political and economic interests in a pragmatic way and adopting a realistic approach. Also, this crisis highlighted the increasing politicization of energy issues, the fact that this has become a contentious issue between Gulf states and the United States of America. When it comes to the positive aspects, the revenue of oil put an end to decades of recession and or slowing down of the economy, and could lead to better economies in the future. Saudi Arabia wants the price of 73 to 76 dollar per barrel for the budget of the kingdom. Also, the price of the barrel at the level of 80 is beneficial to all countries in the region. Between 70 and 90, 80 on average is really good for the economic policies of the countries of the region. As to the options, there needs to be options when it comes to policymakers. First of all, resisting alignment in an international community where competition and rivalry is increasing, and there's a multipolar world, and continuing in some sort of security partnership with Western countries, at the same time strengthening presence in the East, countries like India, Japan, South Korea, because 3 out of 4 of the fossil fuels of the Gulf sent to Asian markets, particularly China. What is the future of OPEC Plus? This is a very important question. We said that one of the winning cards of oil producing countries, particularly KSA and UAE, the surplus production capacity. This is important. OPEC Plus cannot be done away with, although they talk about it being a cartel. Even or if OPEC did not exist, another organization would have been created. Why? Because the market cannot be managed without this control. We're talking about a strategic key commodity and the day-to-day life of humanity. This is not to defend OPEC Plus, but this is just an observation about the situation and the oil market. OPEC Plus, according to the current figures, is 43.3% of fossil fuel exports. Just when it comes to the climate commitments, when it comes to international law, so Gulf countries ratified the Paris Agreement, which stipulates an NDC for every country, so national contribution, national determined contribution, and what we can notice about these in the Gulf, they are ambitious, but they lack details and quantitative measures. And also, if we examine the Saudi model, they do not mention doing away with the sales of oil for strategic reasons and KSA. When it comes to national companies in the region, for instance, in Qatar, so QP here, Qatar Petroleum, changed its name, and our colleague mentioned, Mustafa also said that the Norwegian company did the same. So today, Qatar Petroleum is Qatar Energy, QE, and this is in line with the particular interest given to the renewables and the green aspect of policies. But Saudi Aramco, for instance, which is a mega company, and also NOC in UAE, so they did not follow in the steps of Total and British Petroleum in terms of going to non-petrol assets. And during the Japan Gulf session, we talked about the future of hydrogen and its different types, the green, the blue, etc. Of course, this will have a big importance in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rashid Al Bazzim, for his beautiful, valuable presentation. Now the challenge lies in the questions. Will the questions be at the same level of strength like the presentations or not? We expect that each each person will be given 3 minutes, and you have to state whether it's a comment or a question, a statement or a question. More than 3 minutes, we will stop you in your tracks. We'll take a round of questions and we'll finish in 30 minutes. Tariq Sheikh, a correspondent of the German news agency. My questions to Laurence and Thomas. Regarding the current crisis of war and energy, what are your expectations of the impact of the war and crisis over the small and medium sized industries in Germany and the future of the ruling coalition with the presence of the Green Party and especially in view of the major U-turns and changes regarding the... Please state your name. My name is Daham Al-Gahtani. I am a presenter for TV program Al-Arabi TV station. In fact, all wars in the history of mankind are over patent oil and energy. There is no exception. There is a new world which is being now, it's in the making, and maybe the war in the Ukraine is a prelude that where the Gulf countries, Russia and China, and North Africa and Egypt will play a role. You did not focus on the role Egypt has played in establishing a gas alliance in the Mediterranean. Are we about to enter a multipolar world or still the American resistance stopping that? All the papers are distinguished, but my question is to Dr. Ayhab. It seems that the impact of the Ukrainian war on inflation is very little, but in the past, and because oil has a lot to do with many commodities, so the Gulf countries are exporting countries, and Germany is the biggest exporter to... Sorry, the Gulf countries are importers, and Germany is the biggest exporter, and the level of uncertainty in the world has risen. This may contribute to inflation and an increase in the inflation. Maybe reality tells us something and your paper concludes something different. The lady there, please state your name. And we appreciate the participation of ladies with us. In the previous sessions, we had to force them to take part. Thank you very much. I thank all the panelists My question to Mr. Ayhab, you calculated, you used the consumer price index in calculating inflation. Maybe if you use the producer price index, the outcome would be different because many commodities which come from the Ukraine are subsidized by our government, like vegetable oils in Kuwait, all used to come from the Ukraine. And also the sunflower oil in Qatar comes from the Ukraine. So if you base your calculation on the consumer price index for goods which are subsidized, maybe you'll get a different calculation if you do it differently. السلام عليكم. محمد عبد الحميد أغلو from Turkey. Mr. Ahab exerted a nice effort, but Turkey is in black always. maybe maybe if we look at it differently, Russia will be in red and Turkey in black, or the other way around. So far as the financial vision is concerned, and the currency war which was imposed on Russia, on Turkey, sorry, has had an impact on things. Assalamu alaikum. Dr. Ayman Urdani from Egypt. In the Gulf countries and the intersection of different positions vis-a-vis the Ukrainian war, is it done randomly or is there some sort of a coordination even behind closed doors? And will it be possible to use this, the incident of this war, to re-establish links and ties between the Gulf countries to be one bloc? Yes. Uh, 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 you want to ask about inflation? Anything? Please go ahead. We want to give the ladies a chance. We don't want them to blame us to say that men are taking over everything. Abdel Fattah from Doha Institute. A question to Dr. Thomas O'Donnell. You said in your presentation that Germany cannot sacrifice the EU policies for long-term contracts with Qatar and Gulf countries. I think in July, German and American companies signed 20-year contracts for 1.5 million or billion cubic meters a year. So how you compare what you said about German policy towards the Gulf countries? Dr. Rachid, in view of the current crisis we know there is fragility in Europe so far as the energy sector is concerned. Can we expect a change in policy pertaining to climatic changes? Will they extend their vision to 2030, 2050? Dr. Majid, please. When I was listening to the four presentations, which had economic titles, but they could not disengage themselves from the political aspect. Any economic reading of the crisis is bound to be influenced by the political aspect. maybe the practice, the political practice, has been politicizing and militarizing the economy. Even researchers now are doing that. They discussing the economy with a backdrop of political events. So far as the Gulf countries are concerned, I think they are prepared to play a pivotal role in the world's future for many reasons. First of all, for the potential they have in the field of energy in its different types, also the political stability, although there is some skirmishes in the northern parts of the Arabian Peninsula and the Iranian interference, but it's the areas described as the last stable oasis in the world. Also, in the economic and trade exchange between the East and the West, our area lies at the heart of it, and also it's well placed on the Silk Road, and also there are attempts to bypass the Red Sea and the Bab el Mandeb Straits, and to avoid this land route, which the Chinese are thinking of or planning now, to be closer to the Gwadar port, which the Chinese now are leasing from Pakistan for 30 years. This really makes the Gulf countries candidates to play a pivotal role in the geostrategic aspects. The problem I can think of it, I am speaking slowly for the benefit of the interpreters. The problem that cannot escape my mind is the attempt to make, there's an attempt to dismantle the decision-making process in the GCC, individual and singular by one country and not collective. We see many attempts at this. This is the problem. If the GCC could bypass this problem and find a collective position and chart a strategy to deal with these things, we will see the Gulf being a pivotal center. And I hope somebody will write papers about this. Another question? I'm sorry. Okay. First of all, we talked about this many times: crisis, crisis, crisis. We have Afghanistan, Iraq. The world is full of crises to the point that in a recent event, a British person was speaking and he said the MENA region is in a chaos. So I told him our area is called Chaos Stan, because I'm telling you this because I attended an episode by Jake Tapper, the draconian swab. Either prosperity. Can you please get to the point? Because you moderated this session in an unconventional manner. I'm speaking in an unconventional manner. The Western countries exporting death and death tools and torture tools to despotic regimes. Now even global warming they export to us and take. We say to them, please, it's not appropriate that that you export death to us, and with our money you buy the welfare of your people. We want you to export human rights, fertilizers, agricultural, technological advance. That way, terrorism and violence will end, and we'll all live in peace and prosperity forever after. One final question. The, this is a question from the social media. What's your intake on Algeria's position in view of the Ukrainian crisis? Another question. What's the future of Saudi Arabia and Algeria joining the BRICS, and what impact will that have on the relations with the... See the reaction we are generating? Thank you for this session and for this valuable information. My questions to Dr. Laurence and Dr. Rachid. We are talking about a turning point in the history of the world's economy after World War II until now, and especially in the energy sector. We know the gas contracts are long term, and in economy, like politics, there are no permanent enemies and permanent friends, only permanent interests. Now we see the Russian American relations are highly tense. We don't know. Maybe one day they'll go back to becoming friends again, like what happened after World War II. The fear is after 2 3 years, if the relations go back to some sort of a normality, now for the Europeans, decision makers or people, what matters is the gas prices. In Russia, maybe the regime will change. Maybe if even there is a change, in view of the centrality of the regime, maybe things will not change. In Europe, they may change. What can the exporting countries do to guarantee their gains now and keep that in the future if Russia comes back into the market? And Dr. Laurence, when can Russia come back to its own European geography? This is the question. Thank you very much. Now we give a chance to our panelists. كل متحدث 3 دقائق اللي يختار ما يريد من الأسئلة اللي يجيب عنها، عن 3 دقائق فقط لكي ننتهي. لدينا 16 دقيقة فقط. Thank you very much. The expectations from German news agencies correspond. I think Germany managed in a short term to solve the problems resulting from the mistakes by the ruling coalition. In record time, they managed to refill the strategic storages by 93%, and thankfully we have not experienced a cold winter until now. We are at the end of October, so this serves the interests of the ruling coalition. So luck is on their side and on the Green Party in particular. The problem was as the following. When Germany managed to buy what was available in the market or surpluses from June to September, in 3 months, they managed to refill their strategic storages by 30%. And Dr. Thomas said that from September, the Russians also cut off some of the supplies to Germany, and it was the end of the Merkel era, and so It took them some 3 months, and after that, the ruling coalition, the tripartite ruling coalition, and then with the impact of the war in the Ukraine. I think the results so far are positive. They filled their storage tanks with 93%. In Germany, they announce daily what progress is being made. And so far, winter hasn't been as harsh as was feared. So they managed to minimize the impact of the crisis. As for the small and medium sized companies, it's obvious that there were some victims as a result of the rise in the energy costs on the small and medium companies, which were impacted more than the big corporations, and also the small businesses, retail businesses, and others were impacted. But I don't think in a country where in Germany, like many other countries, the small and medium-sized companies were impacted, but the system did not collapse in a deeply trenched economic system like that. They can overcome immediate problems and they make a comeback. And this is the first time when the chancellor is giving orders to ministers. Maybe this is something unprecedented in the German system. As for the future of the ruling coalition, I think they're following more of pragmatic policies that, for example, the Green Party, that is, because of their commitments to their voters regarding fossil fuels and the 2030, and of course, because of the war, they were forced to change their policies. Maybe the grassroots of the party would understand that, but not the youth. The pragmatists will understand that, but maybe the more conservative ones or the old school in the Green Party may not understand that. Fridays for Future and others, we see the youth are demonstrating sometimes almost on daily basis, but at the level of the traditional leadership like the economics minister and others, they are being pragmatists in unprecedented ways. There are the visits to Qatar, there are the tours actively made to find alternatives, middle of the road alternatives, which can satisfy the promises made to the grassroots and at the same time preserve the government, because they are between a rock and a hard place. They don't know. They're faced with challenges. There are the pressures coming from the grassroots, and there are the demands of government. I think they are moving more towards pragmatic positions than ideological ones. Thank you, Dr. O'Donnell. أولا لم أسمع الاسم السيد الجالس إلى هناك الذي كان يسأل عن لو أن الروس أخرجوا من سوق النفط والغاز. أنا لا أقول أنهم سيخرجون تماما، لكن من المحتمل أن روسيا ستقلل موقعها لتصبح بموقع عضو في أوبك من الطبقة الثانية أو الثالثة لفترة من الزمن. وهذه وجهة نظر حتى الهيئة الدولية للطاقة أو غيرها. قطر أو السعودية عندما روسيا في طبعا من من الخامس من ديسمبر وبعد ذلك من فبراير النفط والنفط المكرر الروسي سيخرج من السوق. أعتقد أن السعوديين سيتحركون لسد الفراغ. هذه الأسواق ستحتلها بلدان أخرى، وقد تكون هناك عقود طويلة الأمد. السؤال هو ماذا ستفعل روسيا إذا ما أتيحت لهم الفرصة ليعودوا إلى السوق؟ إذا ما أتيحت لهم فرصة لا أدري، لكن طبعا ممكن عكس السؤال أيضا. السؤال هو بالنسبة للأوروبيين المشكلة التي يواجهونها حول طول أمد العقود، هذه قضية أيديولوجية أكثر منها قانونية، لأن وزير عن حزب الخضر طبعا تعهد تعهدا أيديولوجيا بأن في 10 سنوات أن يكون الاقتصاد خاليا من الاعتماد على الوقود الأحفوري، والآن هم عندهم ربما قد يستبدلون الوزير بآخر، لأن هذا ليس واقعيا مثل هذا التعهد. أيضا أقول فيما قاله صديقي وزميلي، صحيح أن الحكومة الألمانية تحركت بسرعة أكثر من حكومات أخرى لملء مستودعات التخزين، وفعلوا ذلك أسرع من غيرهم، لكن هذا الغاز الآن في وضع ظروف شتائية طبيعية لن يدوم أكثر من 2.5 شهور. إذا بدأ الشتاء من الآن فبعد 2.5 شهور سينتهي. لهذا السبب بعض الشركات الصغيرة والمتوسطة أغلقت خطوط الإنتاج، لكن الشركات الكبيرة التي تحتاج إلى درجات حرارة من 5000 درجة ستعتمد على الوقود الأحفوري بشكل كامل. طبعا هناك أيضا مشاكل، هناك حالة من التآزر هنا نتحدث عنها، والقضية ليست فقط إذا ما أردنا حماية الناس من أسعار عالية نستطيع أن نحمي الناس. طبعا هم كانوا فرحين بالادخارات في مجال الطاقة، لكن كلها كانت طوعية. مثلا شركات طبعا لأنهم كانوا يقولون أنهم إذا ما صنعوا الأسمدة في مثلا بنسبة زيادة 10% وباعوها بهذا السعر لن يشتري أحد منهم. طبعا هم يخوضون حربا، وهذا الحرب مع السيد بوتين، وستكون ضحايا في هذه الحرب، وسيعاني الناس من البرد، ولا ندري كيف ستنتهي الأمور، وقد تسوء. هذا الشتاء ربما نتعايش معه، لكن الشتاء المقبل سيكون أشد ضراوة، لأنهم الآن ربما هناك مخزون قد يفي بالغرض حتى نهاية الشتاء، لكن في الشتاء المقبل طبعا الأمريكيون سيزيدون إنتاجهم بنسبة 25%، لكن ذلك سيحتاج إلى 4 و5 سنوات. هذه هي القدرة على الضغط التي يمتلكها بوتين في المدى القريب. شكرا لكما. الآن دكتور أيهب لديك 3 دقائق. Thank you. Very important questions indeed. I'll start with Dr. Yusuf. I agree with you entirely about the uncertainty aspect. Uncertainty is the main reason which makes us think or link the geopolitical risk with inflation. What's interesting is the oil prices and the rates of inflation. Maybe I made a mistake in not explaining that in my conclusions. I did not say that there is no impact of the war on inflation. What I meant is but there is not necessarily an impact which is different than the other areas in the world. That's why I discussed the inflation in the world first, and it is obvious that there is an inflation in the Gulf which is around 5%, and the same applies to the world, and for many reasons. But whether the impact in the Gulf is more than other areas, this is what I said was not clear. Oil prices have a double effect on the Gulf countries because the oil prices increased and inflation increased, and also when the oil prices increase, the expenditure increases, and this applies more pressure on inflationary rates. But this is still a subject of research. The Gulf countries use policies to deal with this crisis in a manner which is different than increases in the oil prices in the past. We did not see an increase in the expenditure, and maybe the approach was to contain the impact, and maybe this led to reasonable rates of inflation in the Gulf, different and other areas, and this is similar to CPI and PPI, as the lady said. Yes, and this can also explain somewhat why the inflation has not reached high levels like Europe and the US. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ayhab. Now, Dr. Rashid, we saved the best till last. You have 3 minutes. Thank you for your interaction. There was a question from a colleague from Kuwait about a new world being in the making. The no doubt, in any case of birth, maybe the labor will be difficult and the delivery will be difficult. Some people say that there is the liberal democratic pivot standing up to the despotic regimes, and there are countries which are rejecting the hegemony of the West in one camp and pro Western countries in another. This, of course, all crises lead to change, and change is born as a result of going through the process of crises being dealt with, and this all of this is bound to have an impact on everything, including the energy markets. Abdel Fattah's question about commitments by the EU countries regarding climatic change. It's true that momentarily now they are reoperating some coal power plants, and they are thinking of increasing the reliance on peaceful nuclear energy to produce electricity. But from an official point of view, the EU countries are still committed to the ceilings they set for themselves and their commitments under the Paris Agreement, and also they are working to increase their commitments on annual basis for including the climatic aspects into their economic policies. Maybe even further, there are those in the European Union countries. Some see this crisis in the Ukraine as an opportunity to pay more attention to renewables and produce electricity from renewable energy sources, especially in countries which suffer from relying or even being addicted to fossil fuel and not diversifying their energy sources like Germany. Another question was about the return of Russia and the long-term gas contracts. Russia's return to the international scene in general, I think this is dependent on how this current crisis would develop, and to what extent Can Russia respond to the conditions dictated by the Western camp and the so called going back to the normality of like adhering to international law? Maybe from a geopolitical point of view, this will be difficult after what they've done. Maybe they'll choose to turn to the Asian markets. Maybe this can benefit them economically, but it will not be easy and cannot be achieved overnight, and it will require huge investments. And even more than investments, it may require the extent of Russia's readiness to share its values with other countries, because the Western camp said always that they promoted their universal values of respecting human rights and liberal democracy, etc. This, for Russia, it will be difficult to go back to certain things. Thank you. Thank you. We've come to the end of our session. I would like to express our thanks again to the Arab Center for allowing us this opportunity as researchers and moderators to deal with this important, and please allow me to thank Dr. Laurence al-Hinawi and Dr. Thomas O'Donnell for his effort and valuable information, and to my right, Dr. Ayhab Saad, and the valuable knowledge he imparted, and Dr. Rachid al-Bazzim. And I promised to visit him at his expense to get him as a reward of his contribution.